Hello, Jera. My name is Anne Luce. I am a principal academic in journalism and communication at Bournemouth University.
Hello, I'm Sallyanne Duncan and I'm a senior lecturer in journalism and media ethics at Strathclyde University in Glasgow.
So in today's paper, we're going to talk to you about the statistics on suicide. We're going to introduce you to the responsible suicide reporting model, which will include Sallyanne's 5-narrative model, my 4 ethical rules for responsible reporting, 1 standard of moderation that we've created, and we're also going to talk to you about how you can teach the responsible suicide reporting model. So in 2018, there were 6,507 registered suicides in the UK, which was an increase of 11.8% over the previous year. Now, each suicide in the UK costs £1.7 million for an annual economic impact of £11.1 billion. And that is made up of lost future economic earning potential, the cost to the NHS, and the costs associated with supporting those who have been bereaved by suicide, of which we know can be anywhere between 6 and 135 people for every 1 suicide that occurs. We know that the research shows that reporting suicide has the potential to cause significant harm, yet if conducted responsibly, ethically, and sensitively, such harm can be mitigated. In a recent survey that we conducted of journalism students in the UK and Ireland, we learned that less than half, only 45%, knew about the Independent Press Standards Organisation's suicide reporting guidelines. Only 42% said that they had knowledge of similar codes published by the National Union of Journalists, or Ofcom, and only 38% knew about the ones that were in the BBC editorial guidelines. Just 36% knew the Samaritans even had suicide reporting guidelines, and only 25% were aware of the World Health Organization guidelines, and 18% had never heard of media reporting guidelines on suicide at all. What further alarmed us was the fact that while 86% of students said that they should learn how to report suicide on their university degrees, 73% of them said the topic of suicide reporting had yet to actually come up in any teaching, leaving them very confused in their editorial decision-making process. So Sallyanne and myself have been researching in the area of suicide, death and trauma for a number of years now. Sallyanne has written suicide reporting guidelines for the National Union of Journalists, and I've contributed to 2 sets of guidelines for the World Health Organization. The fact that students appeared unprepared to cover a suicide story, and also from interviews with journalists that we've completed over the years, who have told us that there are too many sets of guidelines and that it was hard to remember what to do on deadline, actually led us to creating the responsible suicide reporting model, which all journalists, we believe, globally can apply. The responsible suicide reporting model was born from previous work that we've both completed over the last decade. We identified that Sallyanne's narrative model of grief provides recognizable, clear structures for journalists on how to construct effective, accountable suicide stories, and my categories of stigmatization and rules for responsible reporting enable journalists to test whether they have produced responsible, ethical content that minimizes harm to those who are affected by the story. We ended up mapping IPSO, NUJ, Ofcom, BBC, Samaritans, RTE Press Council of Ireland, Ireland's National Union of Journalists Code of Conduct, SPJ and WHO guidelines onto our model. We then agreed that we needed to create a standard of moderation so that journalists could quickly identify whether their stories were ethical and responsible. We hope that these will one day be printed on little cards that journalists can carry around in their back pockets, similar to what journalists do here in the UK when they carry around the IPSO Editor's Code of Practice. I should also note that we have tested this model on a further 131 suicide stories in 2018 and 2019. Now, Sallyanne's influential 5-narrative model of news stories about unexpected deaths provides a taxonomy that determines how journalists frame the bereaved personal narratives as expressions of their grief. So the 5 narratives are event-driven. So this is the first recognition by the media that a traumatic event has occurred and that a newsworthy death has actually happened. Post-judicial, which focuses on a court case, an inquest, or other legal proceedings. Tribute-driven stories, where the grieving family and friends pay tribute to the deceased. The anniversary narrative, which is actually normally marked after the first anniversary of a suicide, but it can be later ones, perhaps in the 5-year or the 10-year or 25-year blocks, as we saw with Kurt Cobain's death in April of this year. An action as memorial, and this is where the bereaved family and friends, they undertake a campaign, they fundraise, they set up a charity in memory of their loved one. So we ended up using these narratives to identify the types of stories that journalists were writing about suicide. Now, my ethical rules for responsible reporting came from work that I completed on the Bridgen suicides back in 2008, where I was able to identify 5 categories of description that journalists use to other and stigmatize the issue of suicide. I spent much of the last decade testing these categories for robustness, and they are reaction to death by those left behind, reason for death, description of the deceased, infantilization, and blaming the internet or social media. The ethical rules came about when I started testing each category for newsworthiness. So asking at what point in the story gathering process or story producing process do journalists begin othering the act of suicide? And you can read more about that in my most recent book, Ethical Reporting of Sensitive Topics. Now I broke the analysis down into 4 simple rules for journalists to remember. SSGG, do not sensationalize, do not stigmatize, do not glorify, and do not gratuitously report. Now, when we merged Sallyanne's narrative model with my categories of description and rules, we recognized that we needed to create a standard of moderation, or a middle way between excess and frugality, in order to avoid extremes in behavior. From the interviews I've conducted with journalists and from the plethora of research that's in the field, we know that journalists can't remember suicide reporting rules in codes and guidelines, and we also know that they are too hard-pressed for time to consult them. Applying a standard of moderation to their stories would enable journalists to produce content that is more responsible. The standard of moderation avoids sensationalistic and harmful reporting. It minimizes harm to those affected by their coverage of suicide. They tell the truth, but they don't use it as an excuse to use explicit details that could encourage others to take their own life. There is also accountability in that they avoid stereotypes, harmful content, and stigmatizing narratives. Using our standard of moderation, they get to check in with themselves and ask, is my reporting on this suicide moderate in content, tone, and language? We also ask them to think about their use of social media, which we feel, based on our research, is seriously lacking. Media reporting guidelines are outdated and urgently need to be rewritten to focus more on this. And they need to focus more on online and digital reporting tools as well. We've also reminded journalists through the standard of moderation that they need to provide helpful support boxes alongside their stories, which again, we know from colleagues' research in the field that this has a positive impact on supporting vulnerable people.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Now I'm going to talk about teaching RSR. It's fine to have a model, but journalism educators need a framework for how they can teach media reporting of suicide. So we've created one of those too. We're currently working on a suicide reporting toolkit, which we launched in January, which will be launched in January, and there will be resources available for both journalists and journalism educators. So just to provide you with a brief overview of the teaching framework, we're asking journalism educators to engage their students actively in producing suicide stories. Students will interact and absorb relevant ethical advice more readily than passively receiving similar information from lectures. Storytelling is what journalists do day in and day out. So it makes sense to embed it in our RSR model. By doing so, we give students a concrete place to think about method, location, victimisation, blame, and the potential harm their words can do. Media reporting guidelines are already embedded within the RSR model, so the process of telling the story creates a new habit through the process of reporting and writing, also becoming a reflective process for practitioners too. So how do we actually do it in the classroom? Well, here's just one of our basic teaching plans. And there'll be much more on our website where we will host our responsible suicide reporting toolkit. Begin by explaining the RSR model to the class. Use an exploratory approach by collaborating with your students, but don't let them loose on real vulnerable people. Provide them with simulated police press releases, some social media posts, a statement from a bereaved family, some video footage or pictures. The material you use will depend on the type of narrative you want them to tell. Build their confidence by having them work in groups. Give them the material and let them consider which narrative types are appropriate to the content. Prepare them to write the story based on the material. Then work with them to apply the RSR model. Ask them to share their approaches with the class. Check they've adhered to the narrative type, have applied the 4 rules and the standard of moderation. Finally, discuss their choices and experiences of the whole process as a class. But how does this work in practice? Let's look at one narrative type, the event-driven story. This was the second largest category in our research sample and is probably the most recognisable worldwide. We divide the narrative types into content, ethical rules and standard of moderation. So in event-driven stories, the content invariably contains the first record of the death, the circumstances of the death, but sometimes this is left out in suicide stories, details of method, location, the deceased's mental state, but approach these with caution because students need to think about how much detail to include in these stories to avoid potential harm. These narratives also contain speculation on who or what is to blame, including mental health issues, the most frequent explanation in our research sample. Here the reason can be as important as the actual death. So ask your students, is providing a reason warranted or sensational? Once students have sifted out the relevant content, they should test their choices by applying the ethical rules. They should be aware that there is a high risk of sensationalising, stigmatising, glorifying and gratuitously reporting in these stories. So it's important you raise awareness of these potential harms through team discussions. Also, students should know that all 5 categories of descriptions where journalists can stigmatise appear in the event-driven stories. From reaction to death by those left behind to blaming the internet and social media. Lastly, students should test their stories by applying the standard of moderation. Because the suicide method is significant in event-driven stories, encourage students to seek the middle way between the extremes of excess and restraint. For example, in a story about hanging, students should report that the deceased killed themselves by hanging, but they shouldn't describe the ligature, the length of the drop, or specific details about the location. Remember the outrage over the coverage of Robin Williams' death. Raising awareness of implicit statements about the method is also important. For example, the cliffs at Beachy Head in the English coast are well known as a place where people kill themselves. In our sample, some reporters alluded to a suicide by referring to a body found at the bottom of the cliffs, but didn't explicitly say that they had died by suicide. Again, students should ask themselves the 6 questions noted in our standard of moderation to make sure their reporting is responsible. So, where do we go from here? We presented this work at the World Journalism Education Congress in Paris in July, and it was well received. We focus a lot on journalists and what they do when it comes to reporting suicide, but actually we need to focus some of those efforts and support on where they are learning their trade. Few journalists these days enter a newsroom when they're 16 or 18 years old. The professionalisation of the field means that many students are studying journalism or communication before they enter a newsroom. So it's important to work with journalism educators so that they can teach the journalists of tomorrow what they actually need to know, so should they ever have to report a suicide story.
Thanks, Jera. We hope you're having a great conference.
Thanks, Jera, and hopefully we'll see you at the next conference. Bye for now.
Bye.